question here had to do with assignment 3, and particularly the tests associated with input state, calc state. Is that right? The question had particularly to do with the issue of testing input-related functionality, user input-related functionality. For user input-related functionality, the test that one can do in a fully automated fashion is often limited by the frameworks you're using. There are a set of frameworks that try to automate delivery of input to user interfaces. So for example, typing random strings into a command prompt or whatever. You're not going to have easy access to those sort of frameworks as part of this assignment. What I would suggest is the following. I would suggest at the least that you consider taking your program and running it with input that's redirected into it as if it's typed, and you make sure that it gives reasonable output for that, so that it's actually printing out anticipated values. For example, when you add together through the user interface some predefined vectors. When you multiply several vectors, it should give a certain set of output. This is really sort of end-to-end testing. It's testing that's not just at the unit level of one particular function, or by extension, when we're dealing with object-oriented code, one particular class. It's testing that's sort of starting the program up, giving it some input, seeing the output, and maybe quitting from it. And the output for that, from that process, should result in an output that could be compared, such as with a command line utility called what? What do you use in Unix to compare one file with another? Diff, yeah. You can also use CMP to compare bytewise by bytewise. You can make sure that basically that's giving the output that's expected, right? And if you do that for a number of cases, which you anticipate, it will really lower the chance that some whacked out error has screwed up one of those things along the way that's delivering that message. You know, it won't be by accident that it's according with all of this input-output behavior. It's actually a test that is testing a lot of things at once, and if it's passing that test, a lot of things have to be working right for it to pass all those tests in turn. So, in short, you know, if you had your command, you know, VE count, your program, and you piped it in something from, you know, UI test 1.txt, something like that. This is for the user interface, right? And you had UI test 1.out.txt or something like that, and then you were to do a diff between that and some known sort of correct output. That could be an effective test. The important thing, you know, the really important thing to grok about that is that you're not just testing the code given to you for input state, right? You're not just testing that code. You're actually doing an end-to-end test on your code as well, right? Because your code is being called by, manipulated by that code that I've given to you as part of the assignment. So this is not a test of you know, the solidness of the code we've given. It's an end-to-end test of the system. And as such, that would go by the name of a system test. A system test rather than a unit test. So we've been predominantly in this class talking about unit testing, where we are calling off to a given function with known inputs, and it's very focused on the functionality of one small subpiece. sometimes that function actually calls other things. So maybe we're calling off to A, and A is a solitude and just returns a value, and we check the correctness. This would be a classic unit test. An expansion of this, bearing in mind the exam, that it's good to know about is sometimes this thing that's being called is not a solitude, but it actually calls off to other things. Right? So we may be calling foo, and foo calls, well, you know what foo calls, right? It calls bar, and maybe it calls Baz, and maybe it calls Zap here, and each of those returns some things. Testing this involves one of two choices. So a classic unit test here would involve doing what to these functions? You would do a test for each of those, and then actually for testing foo by itself, what we would actually do is we test against stubs of these, or what are called faking them. We create fake versions of these. Test that these things return, the fake versions, the stub versions return a fixed value, for example, or some known value. Maybe they check that the arguments they've been passed are meaningful, make sure that foo is giving them non-null pointers or whatever when they're supposed to have them. But basically we sort of have this instead go to a fake version of each of these that sort of tests the sanity. So bar, Baz, Zap would be temporarily, for the sake of the test, replaced by a stubbed version that just does some known things and tests the sanity of the arguments it's been passed. Passes back reasonable things that are, you know, look on the face of it to be sort of reasonable values back to foo, but don't do anything near the fulcation. And that allows foo to be tested more or less in isolation. So you could do a unit test here with stubbing, or what you could do is let it call these things, in which case we call this a unit integration test. It's testing a small area of the program, you know, in terms of its integration. What we're talking about here, where we are taking your program or piping data into it and taking data out of it, this would be called the system test. It's a system-wide test. You're testing functionality from soup to nuts. You're testing functionality, you know, about how it starts up, how it initializes itself, how it takes user input, how it answers user input, how it quits. That is a unit test. It's an end-to-end form of testing. You know, in terms of the final, I might suggest that, you know, being clear on this distinction between sort of a unit test and the role stubbing might play within. So, question. Yeah. 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 Oh, okay. That's interesting. So in what sense was it unpredictable?
Like you would say like operation in this case and automatic things is operation.
It doesn't output what you would, so
Yeah.
it's as if you're not the type.
Mm.
So it just
Like
has.
if there was number of elements in the vector, you put 3, it would just put the next command right next to that instead of like taking it into the file, reading and acting so there's
Oh.
It's because usually you press an enter at
Yeah.
the end, and there's no enter, so it just goes through a giant line.
Uh-huh.
Because your input
and
is
there's line
exactly
breaks at
this.
certain points, but I can't really figure out
Okay. Well, so that's interesting. So if you were to put appropriate line breaks into the input file,
I tried /n and backslash file.
it didn't.
It basically, it takes those as you would be typing in keyboard, but that doesn't go standard out, so it's allowed to stand out.
Uh-huh.
You have to
Okay.
make this program do
So you folks are, and this is a decided comment, you folks are fine if you go ahead, if you want to modify it so that it puts out things in a more repeatable that is completely fine. If that would aid your situation, you know, simplify your task, so you don't have to putz around with trying to insert new lines or what have you. But bear in mind that there are other options. I mean, you could, for example, pass this thing through SED to clean up some stuff and do some replacements so it's all formatted in a clear way or what have you. So that's not the only option to sort of go change the actual code. But I'm surprised at that issue. I'll go take a look at that after this. But I could understand how that might get in the way of testing. But remember, with tools like SED, with tools and with the ability to change the actual code, if you really want to do an end-to-end test, I don't think there should be any real structural barrier to do it. Okay? Yeah.
Is it okay if we just test by hand, or should we use that?
It is desirable if you do support some sort of a format like this. I mean, one thing is you could put a bunch of these in a single file. So imagine this is now in a file called, you know, my tests or something like my UI tests, right? You could put these one-on-one on the file, and then you could say bash my UI test. It will actually run all those things, you know, one after the other. And so then every time you go and you fix a bug in the file, in your DECal, you could actually go rerun this without sitting there like you know, like a monkey just entering these things and making mistakes occasionally. It would be much more efficient at some point to just have, you know, 10 or 20 of these there, and you don't have to worry about actually going and re-entering them every time you've changed it or what have you. It might save you time if you're working against a deadline and you want to show output from your file in the final version. Just being able to rerun this in an instant by saying bash this thing, where this is just a bunch of commands, that might be really advantageous. See what I mean? Yeah. So those are good questions. So those are some comments related to assignment 3, UI testing. I mean, comparatively speaking, folks, your job is much easier than the job you would have, or you will have next year, when you're dealing with UI testing through graphical user interfaces. Because there, imagine, how do you pipe in clicks on a button, pull downs to drop down menus? How do you pipe in, you know, the fact that someone has to click on a link? Here you're dealing with text input, text output. It's actually comparatively easier to sort of verify the output of it. That's why there was that story about the 3 thumbs up, right, early on in the class, because they thought they were testing the UI. It didn't work. All that happened is it did something, but what happened is it didn't even log in to do the test. So comparatively speaking, you have a lot of luxury here in terms of getting it to take input in and have put well-defined things out, and you might really want to take advantage of that. Don't get me wrong, but you know, automated testing will take you further, and I don't think it should be too hard. Okay? So other questions related to that? So I think I'll do a purpose-built video.